Hello everyone, I'm Chandna Singh Nirwan, and I welcome you all to the Stories of Women's Identity and Social Control, curated under TMY's Review December 2021 in association with Oxford University Press. We're calling for submissions of stories, poems, and essays, and you can visit our website www.tellmeastory.biz for project architecture. Moving on to today's session on Unhushed in the Pyre, the narratives of Sati and Jauhar, I'm delighted and honored to welcome our esteemed panelists, Professor Dinesh Bhugra and Professor Amita Singh. I'll quickly introduce our panelists. Professor Dinesh Bhugra is an emeritus professor of mental health and cultural diversity at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience at King's College London. He was the past president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. He has been the president of the World Psychiatric Association for a 3-year term, 2014 to 2017. He was awarded Commander of the Order of the British Empire, New Year Honours in 2012. He was in the HSJ Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic Leaders list in 2013. For his contributions to rights of LGBTQ plus individuals, he was ranked number 1 in Outstanding FT List for LGBT Public Sector Awardees 2017 and number 3 in 2018 and in 2019 and in the top 100 in 2020. He was inducted into Hall of Fame of his alma mater in 2018. He was in the top 10 of British LGBT Awards 2018. In a global poll, was voted Global Champion for Mental Health in 2018. He was one of the 4 finalists in the Asian Achievers Award 2019, and he's been awarded Honorary Doctor of Science in Psychology from University of East London 2019. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Professor Amita Singh, who is a professor of history at Government Maharani Lakshmibai Girls College, Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh. She is a prolific writer and has many international and national publications to her credit. She has been teaching history of Indian art and culture, the cultural history of India, especially Central India and Rajasthan, and gender studies for 25 years now. Her highly acclaimed works include documentaries on history, The Relics of Sati, Widow Burning in India, and other short films, apart from many books and projects she has worked on. We welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you.
I would now invite Professor Bhugra to kindly share his perspective on today's topic, Unhushed in the Pyre, the narratives of Sati and Jauhar.
Thank you very much, Chandna, for that very kind and generous introduction and for inviting me to be part of the panel today. I'm a psychiatrist by training and background. I have written about Sati as a form of suicide. So I'm coming at it from a very different angle. I'm not a historian, and I really look forward to hearing from Professor Singh to learn a bit more about the historical perspectives. For me, when I was growing up in India, in Haryana, in the 50s and the 60s, it was very much, you heard about Sati and Jauhar as part of your historical learning. And it was seen as something to do with honor. One of the big challenges really is that it's women who end up in those acts of Sati and Jauhar. Now, the question that we need to address, and hopefully we will be able to pick up, as the role the culture, society, and the male control plays in influencing how people end their lives in those kind of situations. Sati is both a goddess, it's a process, and it's also an act. So the challenge really is, are these women being forced directly or indirectly. If we look at suicide, and that's the perspective I'm going to focus on a bit, Emile Durkheim, when he talked about, he was a French sociologist, and he wrote about suicide. And basically, he started off with the perception that the rates of suicide varied between Roman Catholics and Protestants and other religions in France. So he identified that there were four different types of suicide. There was fatalistic, where people felt life is not worth living and they would kill themselves. There was altruistic, that you're doing it for the betterment of society, culture, others, be it family, be it kinship, be it your tribe. And I was talking to a colleague last week who was telling me that in Tamil Nadu recently, there was a student who committed suicide, died by suicide, and the government decided to give his family jobs and compensation money. And you can imagine what happened. There were 3 further suicides. So that can be seen as a form of altruistic suicide, where people are that I may die, but others will benefit. The third type was anomic suicide, when there's chaos in the society, chaos in the family, people may wish to take a way out. And the last one he talked about was egocentric suicide. Now, bearing that in mind, that if you are egocentric, you're an individualistic individual and you are killing yourself, you have very different notions. As a psychiatrist, we know that the rates of suicide are much higher among people who have mental illnesses. But some of these that I have described may not be related to underlying mental disorders, psychiatric illness, or psychological stress. So these are very much sociological perspectives that we need to be thinking about. Linked within that is the challenge to Sati and Jauhar. And particularly if you come from very sociocentric cultures and the times of 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, when the rates were directly affected by Mughal invasion, particularly in Rajasthan, that indicates that as a member of a sociocentric society, you're a sociocentric individual, your identity is bound in the group, in the kinship, in the tribe. You're not who you are. You're, son of so-and-so, grandson of so-and-so, you're so-and-so's daughter, so-and-so's sister, so-and-so's granddaughter. So your identity is very, very different. So under those circumstances, those acts are partly to do with family honor and partly to do with that sociocentric responsibilities individuals have. And perhaps we can have a conversation later on about the pressure that the males place on women, the expectations in a patriarchal society that people have of women, their genders, their gender roles, and more importantly, their gender role expectations. How do we expect women to behave? And that in itself is an important aspect of trying to understand the whole phenomenon of Sati and also Jauhar, which is mass suicide. And again, I mean, if you look at Ramayana, there's a very clear history of depression among Suryavanshis. Now, not depression as we understand it now, but symptoms of depression nevertheless. And I think that the use of the word depression needs to be taken with a pinch of salt here, because in Hindi and Punjabi and Urdu, there are no words which describe depression. But that does not mean that people don't suffer from it. So among the Suryavanshis, there's history that Dasharath had depression, particularly after Lord Rama was exiled and left home. So he withdrew, stopped eating, turned blue. And Lord Rama himself had what could be called feeling low, feeling sad, etc. And then when he died, number of people who walked into Saryu River near Ayodhya to kill themselves was mass suicide. Now, the challenge, and we should not be placing modern interpretations on scriptures or what had gone on in 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century in Rajasthan and elsewhere in India. Suffice it to say that we cannot ignore the role culture plays, the gender roles in any particular specific culture, and the external pressures which push people towards self-harm and suicide. So I think I'm going to sort of stop there and hand over to Professor Singh.
All right. Thank you, sir, for bringing in so many different dimensions to the topic. I would now invite Professor Singh to share her views on this topic.
Thank you, Chandna. I will start actually my journey in finding Sati memorial pillars, archaeological evidences of Sati. I have working on it past 11 years, and my journey started for the search of Sati stones in 2005 when I saw a pillar with upright female hand with bangles, a couple standing with holding hand in hand and covered with sindoor. I heard that this is a Sati memorial and about it is 200 years old. One day I went and examined it and found that the pillar is older than 200 years. And the villagers worshipping it as a Devi during Navratri. I took a picture and then it start exploring reading material and such type of Sati memorial pillars. But unfortunately, I did not find a single book or research article on it. And one day I went to the state museum near my home. And I visited library also and found some memorial pillars in the backyard of the museum. With curiosity, I saw and them, and luckily I have found four Sati memorials. Some have an inscriptions in Devanagari. I took pictures and with the help of museum guide, I read some lines and found the name of the warrior and the Sati with some details. This was my first Sati inscription, which I deciphered and related to the history of Sati of Gond tribes actually. Then I decoded other Sati inscriptions of the museum and start taking notes of Sati stones. After a few years later, when I decided to do my postdoc research, the first thought was in my mind to pursue my research on this topic. So I took Sati custom and Sati memorials of Central India as my postdoc research. I have taken some major Sati sites for my postdoc research, and luckily in 2005, I got UGC funding for my further research, and I was able to collect more information in these stones. With the help of field associates, we used new technology, registered the Sati stones on using GPS and mapping them with minute details. So now we have more accurate data of Sati stones, especially in Central India. And uh, my husband and I usually go to for research in surrounding areas of Bhopal, and it is like our family visit. And I took my sons with me, and we enjoyed our field survey. I carried a camera and laptop with me and captured every details. The villagers were very helpful, and many sati stones I have found with their help and information. But on some occasion, it is difficult to take information from the local people because they thought that I am a media person. And if they talk about the sati and sati worship, which is illegal after 1987 Devrala Sati case, they might be punished. They think they might be punished, so they refuse to talk to me. So it was difficult to convince them that I am not a patrikar, a media person. I am a researcher, and my job is to collect the information about the sati stone. Secondly, we have a taboo in our society that women should not enter in Shamshan Bhumi. So I managed to enter the places and just for the photographs. And my passion for the sati stones and research, actually, sati is always a thrilling topic for me because I heard from my grandfather that we have a sati in our family, and her name was Sati Rupai. So I had many questions: what is sati, why, how, and where she became sati, and do we have any records? So he used to tell some stories, but I was not satisfied. Then I exploring my family history, and I came to know that we are migrated from Rajasthan, a place called Falodi, about one generation before. I also visited our ancestral place and found that we have some sati memorials there in near Ajmer also. So I visited Rajasthan many times and explored major sati sites of Jaisalmer, Bikaner, Jodhpur, Udaipur, Ghanera, Begun, and also listed them. Being a professor of history, I was criticized by the people why you are working on such a controversial topic. You know, sometimes controversy kills research because we have fear of being criticized by the modern days thinkers. So, for getting historical facts about the custom, I have worked so hard to get the data and presented them scientifically by using tabulation work and mapping of sati stones. And actually, this is my story. And now you come to your questions. Your first question you have sent me. It is about your first question is, what is
Yeah,
my
let me
opinion?
read it out, ma'am.
Yeah, yeah.
By the way, ma'am, that was a very informative talk, and thank you for sharing your own story of how you went about researching on Sati. Now, moving
Okay,
on to the question and answer segment. The question is to both
okay.
the panelists, and it is: some of the experts on Sati feel that the issue was not so prevalent and that it was made such by the British to fulfill their agendas. So, how far do you agree with this, and how prevalent or big the issue of Sati was?
Okay. Actually, in my opinion, sati is not so prevalent in the British as Britishers created it. If we go through the archaeological evidences, the percentage of sati is very low. I have documented the sati inscription in central India and Rajasthan, and the results are quite striking for me. Only 0.9% women became sati in 1500 years time span. And sati was a rare event and mostly prevalent in warrior community. Britishers have data about sati, and it's from missionaries' records actually, which mostly documented by the Serampur missionaries, who had the agenda, I think, to propagate the Christianity in India. So this is my opinion.
All right, ma'am. Sir, would you like to add to this?
I bow to the historian. I have no specific data or figures, but I think what we need to bear in mind is that in the colonial times, natives were always seen as exotic, and the otherness, which allowed perhaps an exaggeration of odd habits, would be sort of seen as much more exciting for writing to people back home. So it is. I have no I don't have any data, and as I said, I'm not a historian, so I can't say that in 1500, there were X number of satis, and in 1800 there were Y number, and therefore it had gone up. But I think the point that Professor Singh is making is a really important one, that it may not have gone up, but it's awareness. And once you start a social movement, more and more people become aware, and therefore that may have contributed to the perception that the numbers have gone up.
All right. Thank you, sir. This brings me to my next question. As sir also spoke about how, women were pressurized. So talking about that, do you think that there were, see, apart from religion, do you think that there were other factors that contributed to this abominable practice of sati? Professor Singh? Yes, please.
Okay. Actually, I don't think only religion was the forcing factor behind it. Many reasons were responsible for the custom, like social status of women and dependency on husband. And as I mentioned earlier, the custom was related with the warrior class, so the fear of becoming slaves in the hands of the enemy and the humiliation after the death of her husband were the main forcing factor. We have many examples where Rajput women declared that the death by fire is better than the humiliation after losing battle. As we have seen in many examples, mentioned in Rajasthani bard literature, Muslim chronicles also, Sati and Jauhar are two different customs prevalent among the Rajputs. The meaning of word Jauhar is Jivhar. Jivhar, which means the act adopted by the Rajputs at the time of war, in which the women and children and old people committed suicide by jumping into the fire. When the enemy entered the city or fort, there are some example of the Johar. Actually, the first Johar, it's in Sindh, 712, and the last in 1857. So these are the different things, Johar and Sati.
All right, ma'am. So what do you think were the other factors?
I think there's sort of several things that we need to think about. I mean, warrior class, definitely. One, it's about loss of honor and a sense of shame to sort of protect yourself from being enslaved, from being abused, etc. But let's not forget that quite often widows had a very bad life after their husbands had died. When they were kind of shunted off to Banaras and Vrindavan, and kind of relying on begging and things. So some people may have thought that it's easier to die than to spend next X number of years begging and suffering. The other point that's worth thinking about, and perhaps I can ask Professor Singh to comment on, is the role of fire, because fire purifies. So lots of things. So there was a study in the UK in 1990s, late 1980s, which showed that among South Asian community, suicide by self-immolation was very common. And these women largely were doctors, anesthetists, etc. So they did have access to drugs and other ways, but they chose. So A, it's a very dramatic message. And B, it may be this whole notion of purification, I don't know. So I'd be really interested to know more about that. But equally, I mean, I think it goes back to the gender role expectations. What do we expect our women to be like? How do we expect them to behave, etc.? So that raises real challenges, and particularly as society changes. And in one of the articles that I was reading earlier about the village in Rajasthan, it's that cultures are in transition. between sort of, the old ideas and yet being influenced by American television and, different kinds of dressing and so on and so forth. So that tension and that conflict also can play a role. And in olden days, both for Sati and Jauhar, it might have been that fear of the other taking over and destroying my culture, my feelings, or whatever, might have contributed to that. Professor Singh, what do you think of the role of fire?
Thank you, Professor Bhugra. You've raised a very interesting point. Professor Singh, I think we would like to know your comments on, oh, it's frozen. Okay, no, she's there. So, Professor Singh, can you hear us?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So, ma'am, we would like to know that what was the role of fire, and did it have any kind of a, purgatory experience they wanted to have, and sort of washing of their sins before going to heaven? Is there any kind of a that kind of a dimension you would like to comment on?
Yes, actually, it's a symbol of purification, as Dr. Bhugra said. And I think there is a actually symbol depicted on Sati memorial pillars also, furnace and women entering in the fire. So it has a religious significance also. Dr. Bhugra is, I think he's right.
All right. Moving on to my next question. It is about the Rajput clans. So within them, there were frequent wars, but in such wars,
Yeah.
the women never indulged in self-immolation, unlike the wars with Afghans and other invaders. So do you think it was practiced only because of the involvement of the Afghans and these invaders?
It's a partly right, I think. There was no evidences of women mass immolation like Jauhar. If we talk about the Rajput conflict between the Rajputs, like Jauhar, but incidents of satis occurred and also mentioned in inscriptions also actually. But it is also true that during the medieval period, there is an increase of number in sati incidences, as I have seen in archaeological evidences. And like in central India, we have continuous increase in numbers in mid 13th to 18th century, which is the age of political turmoil. Interestingly, we have also found the name of Muslim rulers and their reigns on the Sati memorial pillars actually.
All right, ma'am.
Yeah.
Sir, would you like to comment on this?
I think it goes back to the question of the other and how you perceive the other and what the fear is. The otherness of Afghans and Mughals is much clearer. Even within the Hindu community, there are, issues to do with caste and class and gender and age and so on and so forth. But the massive difference is creating that other, that they will come and destroy us. So before they can do that, I might as well destroy myself and keep the family honor and avoid a sense of shame. Does that mean that again goes back to the question about data? Do we have the data to say that it definitely went up during the Mughal invasions? And if so, I mean, again, one of the interesting questions would be that majority of these things happen in Rajasthan, but that does not mean that it doesn't happen in other parts of India. So why that? And there have been some sort of very interesting stories about women killing themselves after being rejected by a man or marriage in Germany in the 18th, 19th century. Now, whether the news from India put that idea, or whether it occurred independently. So there's some very interesting questions about, again, going back to the question of what role cultures play in dealing with the other, in dealing with the stress and the fear, and then wars and fights and conflicts.
All right, thank you, sir. Moving on to the next question. In some parts of India, especially in the rural parts, we see that the concept is glorified to the extent that some women who committed self-immolation are worshipped as goddesses. So, what is your take on this, Professor Singh?
Yeah, it's true actually. Sati and Jujars. Jujars means warriors. Are worshipped in rural areas, and but mostly as a family deities actually. In some occasion, like birth of male child and marriages, there is also practice of remembering the date of her sacrifice. Mostly women in the of the family organize a night vigil called Rati Jaga, and they considered satis as the protector of the family. So this is true actually.
All right, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes,
I mean,
sir.
I think
Would you like to say? Yeah.
there's no doubt that it's in a way it's human nature to look up to something, to look up to someone, whether it's real or made up, and somebody who has sacrificed her life for the good or perceived good of the tribe, the community, and the kinship, um, would be held up in high esteem. Now, that's not to condone what's going on. That's just an observation that quite often you see, I can't do this, but they've done it, so I must admire them. So, why the changes between rural and urban areas? And it can't be just because it's something to do with level of education or class or clan or whatever. It's more to do with openness and awareness of other ways of looking at things. And reading about the last major act of Sati and the responses, both from urban and rural, were really striking and strikingly different. So I suppose, I mean, it's not to say that, it's an admirable thing. It isn't. But people create gods and goddesses to give them succor, give them a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of being in the community.
All
I mean,
right. Yeah, please.
in,
Sorry.
in your sort of research, Professor Singh, I mean, did you find that there were differences between rural and urban populations? And most of these sati sthans that you have identified, are they in urban areas or rural areas or a mixture?
No, actually, most of them are in rural area actually, not in urban areas. I don't think so.
Right.
There
So
are some popular mandir like Rani Sati temple,
yeah.
Jhunjhunu. Yeah, one I think, but I don't think it's mostly in rural area actually.
So, but they were built by the rural folk.
Yes, the
So,
family actually.
right, the family of
Yeah,
the
yes.
woman. Okay. So
Yeah,
it's a
small temples very, and it is called Palya. In some areas, it is called Palya.
talia.
The Sati, yes, Sati Sthan, Bija,
Sthal.
there are many things
Sthal.
there.
Okay. Yeah, right.
Yes,
Right.
yeah,
Right. Right.
yeah,
But
yeah.
it kind of, to me, it sort of confirms the question in a way that, if there are more of those in rural areas, and it's a cause and effect, then, is
Yeah.
it because there are more of them because there are more satis in rural areas, or they happen and therefore you have these sthals, and then people pray because they're
Yeah.
there, so it just kind of
Yeah.
sets up that circle.
Yes. Yes. Actually, mostly I have found in rural area and mostly not worshipped by the people. Actually, there are very few satis worshipped by the families. Actually, I don't think so. There are many forgotten satis actually. Many sati stones forgotten by the family. Yeah.
By their own families,
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
right? And I mean, the question really is that, if the families create these little shrines
Yes. Yes.
to remember them by, and obviously, then villagers will attribute certain powers or certain extraordinary um, credentials to these shrines, so they would come and visit or not.
Yes, 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 true. Actually, some particular date, actually, like in Bikaner, there is a Sati Deep cover, I think, the last Sati, and in Bikaner area, she
Right.
worshipped as a goddess. Yeah,
Okay.
in particular, some dates. Yeah.
Mm.
Can we trace this to our mythical texts such as Ramayana, which talks about Sati, Ahilya, and or has the term completely taken a different meaning in those past days?
Uh, I think Sati means good woman, actually. Not Sati is not act, actually.
It, it
Sati,
it
S-U
can
double
be
T, yeah, yeah, yeah.
it can be an act, but it's also a
Yes,
process, and it
yes,
is a good
yes,
woman.
yes. It's a good
Uh,
woman there.
yeah,
Yeah.
Sati Savitri, and
Sati Savitri, Sati Ahilya.
yeah.
Yes.
So I think that's an important distinction, because one could trace that back to the colonial bits, because they saw the act rather than the
Yes.
holiness of the woman.
Yeah, 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 it's true. There is
Indeed.
a term actually for Sati. It's a Sahagaman,
Hmm.
Anugaman. These are the words for the actually custom or ritual, right? You can say. Sati is Sati. It's a woman. Yeah, good woman.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, and thank you so much, sir. And it has been a wonderful experience of talking to you on this topic. Thank you for sparing your time to join
Thank
us
you.
and share your insights.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much.
Thank you very much, Chandana.